Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing an update on my low boost Clio 172. Now, I had planned to do more regular updates of this car, but because of COVID and because of a couple of problems with the car, that's not really been possible. But the plan is to give a brief update of where we are right now with the car, and then moving forward as of April this year, I'll hopefully be giving more regular updates. We'll get the car running again, back on the road, and we'll go from there. So, following on from my previous video about refurbing the rear beam that I brought, it was time to remove the existing rear beam off of my 172 Cup. Now this proved pretty difficult. Despite soaking them in WD-40, using all the right tools, there was nothing that would get them off because they kept spinning, because Renault fitted these captive nuts, basically. They're not really designed to come off the car. So we opted for a more severe option, which was to take an angle grinder to it. Luckily I had my brother on hand to help, so I managed to get a bit of footage as he worked on the car and got them off. Before long, the rear beam was off of the car and we could set to work about taking the brackets off and the rear calipers and replacing them, or putting these onto the new refurbished rear beam. As you can see that it was pretty corroded. The brake lines actually were in good condition after I cleaned them up with some WD-40, but the actual beam itself was slightly worse wear. Purely cosmetic, of course, nothing wrong with it, but it did look a bit unsightly, if you like, and part of this is me just refurbing and looking after the car for the long term. Once the rear beam was off the car, it was just a case of wire brushing down any of the nuts and bolts that I wanted to keep. These nuts that you see here actually ended up getting scrapped and I brought some new ones from Renault, but I retained the bolts because they were in perfectly good condition. Also taken off this car were the rear calipers, and fortunately none of them were seized. They still seemed to work pretty well, they just looked a little bit dirty, so I put them in the blaster anyway, and I'll cover this a little bit later on. And these are the existing brackets once they were off of the old rear beam. As you can see, they're pretty heavily corroded, they're covered in rust, grime, dirt, and so is the underside of the car. Here we've got the fuel tank and where the actual rear beam mounts onto the car. Even the bias valve here that you see for the rear beam, I had to cut the brake lines because it was also heavily corroded. Any bolts that I wanted to retain, that I wanted to keep looking nice, I cleaned up with a wire brush. And here we have the calipers after they've been blasted. They're put back together slightly because I did take out the sliders that you see here, but they were already bust anyway before I put them in the blaster, so it was a case of getting a new kit from Big Red. You can get this on eBay relatively cheaply. This kit came with all of the lubricants, all of the cable ties, all of the bits of rubber that you needed to basically put on your brakes to make them like new. So I set about doing that. That proved to be slightly tricky. Removing the existing ones was simple, but actually getting these to sit properly was quite fiddly. But eventually I got them on and they look great and they all function well, everything moves well, and yeah, I'm really happy with these. So jumping on from my previous video, this is the rear beam with the now taken off and refurbed stub axles. I was careful not to blast the stub axles, but the rest of the stub axle casing was blasted back. These are the Powerflex Purple Series bushes that I've fitted to the car, and these are the new shiny bolts that you get with the 10mm stub axle spacer kit from Pure Motorsport. As you can see here, they're all shiny, it all looks great, and the actual stub axle that the disc eventually sits on has been kept in its original shiny finish. Now, often forgot about are these small washers that actually sit behind the rear discs, and these sit with the chamfer side facing to the car, so the side that you see here, and you'll see how I put them on, and they sit behind the rear discs before you put them on. I think this is only unique to the Clio RS range. Leaving these off of the car before you fit new rear discs can actually lead to premature wheel bearing failure, and they're easily picked up online. They're around £10 for a pair, and yeah, you have to have them on there unless you want to have problems in the future. It's actually worth noting that eventually I replaced the rear discs and got new studs. These weren't even that old, but I decided to get some new discs just because they look better, and ones that didn't rust. Those ones were actually only literally 1,000 miles old and they looked ancient, whereas the ones I've got now have held out quite well. These are just putting the lines back on so that I can get them seated in position correctly, so that I can then set about putting the rear calipers back onto the subframe. I just put a bit of blue stuff on there to make them make sure they don't shake loose. I don't know if this is best practice or not, but it makes me feel more safe, if you like, knowing that they're not going to shake themselves loose. I just did them up hand tight initially, and then eventually used a ratchet, and once all the bolts and things were back on the car, I used a Draper torque wrench to ensure that everything was done up to spec. And you can get all of these specific torque settings on the forum on cliosport.net, or just online in general. They're easily available if you do your research, and yeah, it's worth making sure that everything is done up properly. Now, this is something I didn't document so fully, and probably should have done, but this is some Bilt Hamber Deox gel that's sat on the car, and what it does is it reacts with the rust and eventually makes it so that you can just take the rust clean off and it leaves a shiny finish underneath. Now, I didn't film as much of this process as I would have liked to, but it was such a messy job and the camera was getting covered in this stuff. These are some bolts that I got. Now, these replace the captive nuts that you saw us cutting earlier. Renault want around £13 per bolt, if you like, and you need in total 6 of them. So in total, with the nuts, with the bolts, it was working out at roughly £80 in bolts. So I decided to get some good high quality, high tensile strength bolts online, and I feel that they do the job just as well, but literally for a fraction of the price. Here we see the rear beam all built up now with the bushes and the brackets on, ready to go onto the car, and it's pretty much ready to go. I left the actual building of the calipers until I got the subframe back on the car, and this is just a brand new but slightly modified rear exhaust hanger. A lot of the OE ones sag from even when they're brand new. Here we have the underside of the car once I've done my best to sort of cover up some of the rust and treat it, and then I sprayed it black. In an ideal world, I would like this so clean that it was all Mondial blue underneath. Unfortunately, that just wasn't possible. I spent a good 8 hours on my back working from that height on the car to try and get it to the point that I felt that it was ready to be sprayed, and I felt that black would be best for now. As you can see beforehand, it looked quite worse there, but afterwards it actually started to look pretty good. These are the replacement brake lines that I had made up by a good friend at Archway Auto, so thank you for that, guys. And this is the rear beam before, and finally the after shot. So as you can see, things are a lot cleaner now. We're certainly a lot more rust free, if you like, and overall I'm really happy with the way this has come on. The plan in the future is to do this to the front subframe, which hasn't been treated yet. That isn't rusty as such, but it just doesn't look as good as this. So I want to make everything on the underside of the car look as good as it can. And this is a few photos taken on a ramp. It gives you a better idea of how good the car looks now that it's all been sprayed. So at the moment we're running 10mm spacers on the front, and then the 10mm stub axle spacer kit plus 10mm spacers on top of that. I might actually remove these. I haven't really driven the car much on the 10mm spacers. It looks really aggressive, but it might just be a bit too much with 20mm overall. So it's worth noting as well that part of the delay in updating this was due to the fact that the car developed quite a catastrophic oil leak from the camshaft / dephaser area. I'm not entirely sure what that is. It's going to be investigated in April, which is why when I say get the car up and running again, it does run, it's working, it starts first time, but it's just having that oil leak looked at, because long term it's not really something that I want to drive around with, because it is quite major. Right guys, that's an update, and hopefully an interesting update for you on where my 172 Cup is at the minute. The plan is to get it back on the road as of April this year, at which point we should be doing some comparison videos on this low boost 172 Cup versus a standard 172 Cup, a standard clear 182, even the Yaris GR when that drops in hopefully March, I think it's going to be. So it's going to be on a fresh 21 plate back here soon in March, which will be exciting. And yeah, the next video coming up on the channel will be a review or a long-term owner's perspective on my ST line Fiesta, and I'll be asking the question whether or not it's really a worthy or worthwhile compromise over the full-on ST. So stay tuned for that. If you like the video, please subscribe, and yeah, see you next time.